Chapter 1. Prayers of My Fathers. Imagine the world just before dawn, in that quiet stillness that hangs between night and day. And then, across the lands of the Islamic world, a sound begins. A beautiful, deep voice that seems to welcome the sun over the horizon. From the rooftops and the minarets, a message is shared. It begins with the words, Allahu Akbar. God is great. This is the adhan, the call to prayer. It's a gentle reminder, just as the day awakens, to turn your heart towards God. This call weaves itself into the life of every devout Muslim, a thread of remembrance from morning until night. It gathers the faithful together, uniting them in a shared moment of peace. To someone watching from far away, it might seem as if this call to prayer is what separates the darkness from the light, breathing life into the world with its sound. It's no surprise, then, that this special call is used not just to start the day, but to start a new life as well. There is a tradition, passed down from the Prophet Muhammad, that every child should hear the adhan the moment they are born. And so, when I came into this world, my father leaned in close and softly whispered those same words into my ear. They were the very first words I ever heard, just as his father had whispered them to him many years before. You see, following these traditions was always deeply important to my family. Our name is Qurayshi, which is the same tribe that the Prophet Muhammad belonged to. I remember asking my father about it when I was a little boy, old enough to understand the pride in our name. Abba? I asked. Are we the real Qurayshi, like the Prophet? Yes, my son, he answered gently. He explained that while the Prophet had no sons who lived past childhood, our family line came from another great leader, Hazrat Umar. He was a close companion to the Prophet and a respected guide for his people. It was a noble heritage and a source of quiet pride for our family. It was this love for his family and his heritage that led my father to leave his home in Pakistan in the 1970s. He dreamed of giving a better life to his parents and his siblings. When he arrived in the United States, he followed his older brother's advice and joined the Navy. From every single paycheck he earned as a seaman, he sent money back home, even when it was nearly all he had. A few years would pass before he returned to Pakistan, just for a short while. He had come home to marry my mother. My mother, Ami, had also lived a life of quiet devotion to her family and her faith. She was the daughter of a Muslim missionary. Her father, whom I called Nana Abu, had moved to Indonesia with her mother, Nani Ami, to share the message of Islam. My mother was born there, and so were her 3 younger sisters. Because her father was often away traveling for his mission, and her mother worked to support the family, Amy helped raise her younger siblings, teaching them the ways of their faith. When she was 10, Amy and her family returned to Pakistan. They were welcomed with great respect for their service. Her father soon went back to his work in Indonesia, so my mother's role at home only grew. She cared for 5 younger siblings in all. She was brilliant and finished her schooling at the top of her class, even earning a scholarship for medical school. But she turned it down. Her mother needed her help at home, and so she stayed. Her own mother, Nani Ami, had spent almost her entire life in service to Islam. She wasn't just a missionary's wife. She had been a missionary's daughter, too. She was born in Uganda, where her father had served as a doctor, while also spreading his faith. She was raised in this life of service, and it was the life she chose for herself as well. The community held her in the highest regard, and she was the greatest role model for my mother. Amy hoped, more than anything, to continue that legacy with a family of her own. And so, on the day I was born, I didn't know any of this history. I only knew the gentle sound of a loving voice. The man who whispered the adhan into my ear was my father, a man of noble heritage who sacrificed everything for his family. The woman who watched over us was my mother, the daughter of missionaries, whose heart was filled with faith and a lifetime of caring for others. I was their second child, their firstborn son, and with those ancient, gentle words, they were calling me to prayer. Chapter 2. A Mother's Faith. My childhood was a very safe and sheltered place. I was protected in every way you can imagine, in ways I'm still coming to understand. The few scars I carry from those days are all on my skin, little reminders of small mishaps, and they each come with a story. The biggest one, though it's really no more than 2 inches long, came from a window that fell on my hand when I was just 3 years old, and that day is etched in my mind, not because of the pain, but because of what I learned about my mother's faith. At the time, my father, Abba, was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia. He was in the Navy and had been for 11 years. He worked hard for us, studying for a master's degree at night after long days at his job. I didn't understand all the details then about his promotions or his deployments. All I knew was that my Abba worked hard, and while I always felt his love, I didn't get to see him as much as I wanted. My mother, Emmy, on the other hand, was always there. She was our rock, a constant, encouraging presence in our lives. It seemed like she could do everything. She cooked our meals, she laid out our clothes, she taught us our prayers, and she never seemed to get tired or complain. She did have 2 little rules, though, to keep her sanity. First, no whining after 9 o'clock at night. And second, never, ever interrupt her while she was drinking her chai tea, which was quite often. When we had guests, she was the most wonderful host you could ever meet. She considered it a true honor to welcome people into our home. There would always be more food than anyone could possibly eat. The house would be cleaner than the day it was built, and our clothes would be perfectly pressed. And it was perfectly normal for her to apologize anyway, saying there wasn't enough food or that we all looked a mess. It was part of the dance of hospitality. The guests knew their part, too. They would promise Amy they hadn't eaten such wonderful food in years, that homes in heaven couldn't be much cleaner, and that her children were role models for their own. Hearing this, everyone would be happy. The guests, for being so honored, Amy, for being so praised. And we kids, just for being noticed in the grown-up conversation. Sometimes, our guests would stay for months at a time, and Amy's kindness never faded. I especially remember when my great-ten, whom we called Mama, came to stay. She was just a delight, a big heart and a big laugh and a tiny little body. She was always ready to play board games with me, with endless patience for a 3-year-old. And she always knew just when to look the other way when I cheated. On the day it happened, Mama was at our house. She and Amy were upstairs, and I was playing with my Hot Wheels, the little toy cars my mother would buy me to keep me from fussing at the grocery store. My older sister Baji and I had a deal. She would play Hot Wheels with me if I would play My Little Pony with her. It was a fair trade. I remember I'd always try to convince her that my Pontiac was a much better car than her Lamborghini. That day, Baji had just gone to get her ponies, and I was still racing my little Pontiac around the living room. I looked up and saw the window, the kind that slides up to open, and in that moment, for some reason, I decided it was time for the Pontiac to have a big crash. I zoomed the car along the windowsill with all my might and slammed it right against the glass. To this day, I can't actually remember seeing the window come down. I just remember the sharp, sudden pain, the incredible amount of blood, and my own scream for Amy between gasping sobs. And I remember what happened next. When Amy rushed downstairs and saw what had happened, I saw her face for just a second. She almost started to cry, but then, in an instant, something changed. She was a Navy wife, used to being both mother and father. She knew this was not a time for tears. This was a time for action. She chose, instead, to give her fear to God. She lifted the window, wrapped my hand in a towel, and quickly put on her burqa. She left Baji in Mama's care and carried me to the car to take me to the clinic. All the way there, Emmy prayed. She recited prayers from the Quran, prayers she had memorized, and quiet prayers that came straight from her heart. Her deep trust in God gave her strength. It calmed her fears and gave her a steady resolve. When we arrived at the clinic, I had my first unpleasant introduction to stitches. The doctor tried to ask my mother to wait outside, so she wouldn't have to watch, but I refused to be separated from her. As they stitched up my hand, Amy continued to pray out loud, not caring about the questioning looks from the doctors and nurses. In those days, it was not so common to see a Navy officer's wife wearing a full burqa, murmuring aloud in Arabic and Urdu. Her quiet prayers, her unshakable trust in God, even with her child screaming and strangers staring, that was a testimony of her faith that I have never, ever forgotten. Throughout the rest of my childhood, she taught me many of those same prayers, and I held them close to my heart because I knew their power. I had seen them strengthen her in a time of fear and need, and that left a mark on me, far deeper than any physical scar. Chapter 3. A Community of Four. As I was growing up, I often felt like my family, and I didn't quite fit in with the people around us. It's something that always made my heart feel a little heavy. On the one hand, my life was filled with all the normal things for a kid in the 1980s. Cartoons, plastic toys, and the occasional temper tantrum. You'd think I would have gotten along with the other boys just fine. But people can sometimes be afraid of what they don't understand. And for many would-be friends and their families, my Muslim heritage was something they didn't understand. And so, I was often very lonely. What made it even harder was that my father was in the Navy, which meant we moved around quite a lot. We never stayed in one place long enough to really put down roots. Most of my early memories are like little snapshots, moving out of a house, traveling to a new one, or trying to learn to call another new place home. But these memories are still very dear to me. I remember so clearly, for example, the day we had to leave Virginia. I stood by the screen door on our front porch, watching as strangers carried our furniture out of the house. I was crying and just couldn't be consoled. I didn't understand who these men were, or what I had done to deserve having all my things taken away. But my mother, Ami, was there to comfort me. I remember she chuckled a little bit, and even teased me when one of the men carried away my favorite chair. But I also remember her gentle touch and the soothing sound of her voice. "What's the matter?" she asked, as she took my face in her hands and held me close. "What's the matter, my son?" "They took the chair," I sobbed. "The one with the strawberries on it." "And is that chair more important to you than your Ami?" she said softly. "I'm still here, and so are Abba and Baji. God has given you everything. What more do you need, Bilu?" Bilu. That was the special nickname only my parents used for me, and they used it when they wanted to show their love. In our culture, it wasn't common to say the words "I love you" directly. Love was something that was simply understood. It was shown through the care of a parent and through the obedience of a child. This idea of obedience was very important. Years later, Ami would sometimes say to me, "What good is it to tell me you love me if you don't do what I say?" And later still, when I began to think about following a different faith, I knew it would be the greatest disobedience of all. I knew it would not only feel like a betrayal to my parents, but that it would break their hearts. But back then, at the sheltered age of 4, heartbreak and family troubles were the farthest things from my mind. I just wanted my strawberry chair back. When everything was finally packed up and we were ready to start our journey, Abba gathered us all together. "Let's pray," he said. I raised my cupped hands, just like I saw my parents do, and we all prayed silently, asking God for a safe and easy journey. When we finally arrived at my father's new post, we were in a town called Dunoon, in Scotland. Looking back on it now, Dunoon feels like it was my first real home. It wasn't because I made a lot of friends at school, or knew many kids in the neighborhood. Even the strawberry chair had gone missing in the move. It was because, during those years, I grew closer to my family and deeper in my faith. Primera de Miami Abba and my sister Baji. We were a little community of 4, and I didn't need anything else. Chapter 4. The Perfect Book. When my family arrived in Scotland, I hadn't yet learned to speak English very well. At home, we always spoke Urdu, and if we were going to learn to read and write, it would be in Arabic first. There was a simple reason for this. The Quran, our holy book, was written in Arabic, and it was very important that my sister Baji and I learned to recite it. You see, Muslims believe that the Quran isn't just a book about God. It is the direct, word-for-word message from God. Every single word, we are taught, was spoken by God, through the angel Gabriel, to the Prophet Muhammad. Because of this, the Quran can't truly be translated. If you read it in English, or any other language, it is seen as just an interpretation of the Quran, the true Quran. The perfect word of God exists only in Arabic. TCs. It's so important that the book has been perfectly preserved, unchanged for centuries, word for word, dot for dot. The words themselves are sacred. In fact, the focus on the words is so strong that many Muslims who can recite the Quran beautifully from memory might not know the meaning of the verses they are speaking. To be able to recite the Quran is a sign of a pious heart, which is a greater honor than simply being learned. My mother, Amy, wanted us to learn both the recitation and the meaning. But recitation always came first, every day, for as far back as I can remember. Amy would sit me down beside her. She would place a traditional little cap on my head, and she would teach me to read Arabic. We started with a beginner's book that taught us the letters and their sounds. And then, not long after we moved to Scotland, I graduated. I was ready to begin the Quran itself. I remember that moment so clearly. After I read the very last page of my little practice book, Amy reached beside her, picked up a Quran, and presented it to me. It was my Quran, the very first book I was ever given. I was so thrilled. I ran to show my sister. Baji was playing on the floor near our parents' room, so I got down next to her and placed my new Quran on the ground to show her. All of a sudden, I heard a scream that stopped my heart. It was Amy, and she was running towards me. Nabil, I was too shocked to move. I had never heard her scream like that. I had never seen her run. In a flash, she had scooped the Quran up from the floor. Never, she said, her voice shaking a little, never put the Quran on the ground. Okay, I whispered. Always raise it high. Put it in the most honored place in the room. Wash your hands before you touch it, and only touch it with your right hand. This is not just any book. It is the word of Allah. Treat it with the respect he deserves. Okay. Go now, she said. She was deeply shaken, and I didn't wait to be told twice. From that day on, whenever I carried the Quran, I held it up high. My sister learned from my mistake, too. The next time Amy called us for our lessons, we both walked in holding our Qurans as high above our heads as our little arms could reach. Amy smiled when she saw us. It wasn't exactly what she had meant, but she was pleased. Baji, being the oldest sister, always went first. Amy would point to each word, and Boji would read, her voice not so much speaking the words as singing them. We were taught to read the Quran with a melody, to make the sound of it as beautiful as possible. When she finished, it was my turn. I had never read from the real Quran before, and I was terribly excited. Bilu, Amy asked gently, what do we recite before we start anything? Bismillah, Ir-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. And what does that mean? In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Shabash, good job, she said. We say it so that we remember everything belongs to God, and so that we only do good things. She explained how that beautiful prayer is found at the beginning of almost every chapter, or surah, in the Quran. How many surahs are there? Say. Ask it. 114, I answered proudly. Shabash. And you will read them all soon, God willing. Baji finished the Quran when she was 7, and I want you to finish by the time you were 6. Let's begin. And so the days went on. I learned that the Quran was also divided into 30 parts, which made it easier to read the whole book during the holy month of Ramadan. But those 30 parts were important to me for another reason. Whenever I finished one, Amy would buy me a little gift. My favorite was a Mario Brothers trash can. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. Amy and we would sit down together, open my Quran, and she would point to where I should end for the day. For some reason, I liked to recite exactly 18 verses. If she chose more, I would complain. If she chose less, I'd sometimes read a few extra just to make her happy. Just as she had hoped, I finished reciting the entire Quran just before I turned 6 years old. Amy was filled with delight. At the same time, she helped me memorize the last 7 surahs, which are the ones we recite during our daily prayers. My favorite was Surah 112. It was short, melodic, and easy to remember. It was one of Amy's favorites, too, but for a much deeper reason. The Prophet Muhammad once said that reciting this one short chapter was like reciting 1/3 of the entire Quran. It was that important. And what was the message that was considered so powerful? It was this: God is not a father, and he has no son. Chapter 5. Stories of the Prophet. We're late. Let's go. It was a Saturday morning. and my father was standing by the door, waiting for us. Every Saturday, our family would travel from our little town of Dunoon into the city of Glasgow to our community mosque. It was our favorite time of the week. It was a day we got to spend with other Muslims, almost all of them from Pakistan, just like us. We were all a bit out of place in Scotland, so together we fit perfectly. My mother, Amy, seemed to live for that one day of the week. It was the only time she really let her hair down outside of our home. Figuratively, of course, but also, quite literally, inside the mosque, with only other women around. The burqas would come off, and you'd see that everyone was actually quite fashionable underneath. As much as Amy looked forward to it, she was always running late. In Pakistani culture, being on time isn't quite as important as it is in the West. It's actually thought to be a little rude to show up exactly on time. What if your hosts are still getting ready? You wouldn't want to rush them. Arriving 15 or 30 minutes late is just polite. But my father, he had left that part of our culture behind in Navy boot camp. He was a military man now, and our being late really bothered him. But no matter how hard he tried, he could never change my mother's ways. She would do what she wanted, and he would remind her that he was the man of the house. And then, after a few minutes, she would gently charm her way back into his heart, and his mood would soften. That little dance between them was practically a Saturday morning tradition. But this particular Saturday was extra special. It was a day that came only once a year, a day when our community celebrated the life of the Prophet Muhammad. It wasn't his birthday, just a day we all chose to gather together and tell stories about his life. For Muslims, the Prophet's life is the greatest example of how to live. So we learn the stories of his life, usually by hearing them in sermons at the mosque. It was important for us to go, for our faith and for our friendships. But still, we were late. Come on. Abba called again. Soon enough, we were finally in the car and on our way. To get to Glasgow from our town, we had to take a ferry across a stretch of water called the Holy Loch. My father worked there, on a submarine repair ship, but I didn't know that then. All I knew was that there were two ferries, a small red one and a big black one. And the big black one had a lounge where you could get cheese sandwiches. By the time we were on the ferry, my parents had usually stopped their little squabble, and on this day, they decided to stay in the car and get us ready for the celebration. Amy started quizzing us, and my sister Baji and I would call out the answers. Tell me, she began, when was the Prophet Muhammad born, and where? In the year 570, in Mecca. Good job. Now tell me, who was his father? His name was Abdullah, but he died before the Prophet was born. And his mother, her name was Amina. She died when he was 6 years old. So who took care of him then? His grandfather, for 2 years. And then his uncle, Abu Talib. These were the questions every Muslim child learned. Our parents took great pride in us, knowing these facts by heart. Okay, here's a hard one, Amy said. Tell me something that happened to the Prophet before his mother died. Baji answered this one. One day, when he was playing, she said, 2 angels came and opened his chest. The other children were scared and ran away. The angels took out the Prophet's heart and cleaned it until it shined, and then they put it back. Shabash, my little doll, Amy said. Pleased. Nabil, your turn. Who was the Prophet's first wife? This one was easy. Khadijah, I said. She was a wealthy widow, and he worked for her. She saw how honest and good he was, and so she asked to marry him. Good. Nabilu, how did he find out he was a prophet? He was praying in a cave one day. My father jumped in. What was the name of the cave? The Cave of Hira, I said. An angel came to him and told him to recite. The angel had to ask him 3 times, and then he gave the Prophet the first verses of the Quran. We continued like this, with Abba asking the questions now. Who was the first man to believe? Who was the first child? We answered them all. How did the other people in Mecca treat the new Muslims? Haskit. They were cruel. To them, we answered, they attacked them for years. So what happened? The Prophet had to flee to a new city. Medina. Abba grew quiet then. The waves lapped softly against the side of the ferry. The silence felt heavy after all the questions. I wondered what he was thinking about. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost sad. "Belu," he said, "tell me about the first battle the Prophet had to fight." "It was the Battle of Badr," I explained. "The Meccans came to attack the Muslims. They had 1,000 soldiers, and the Muslims only had 330 men. We won. We did, of course." "Why?" Abba asked gently. "Because we were better." "No, my son," he said. "They were stronger in every way. We won because God helped us. If God had not been there, we would have lost, and the Prophet would have been killed. God will always help the Muslims, because we are his people." Baji then named the other battles that were fought, and Abba asked, "Why did the Muslims fight these battles? Were we attacking anyone?" "No, Abba. Muslims only fight to defend themselves. So what did they have to do to finally stop the attacks? They conquered Mecca. And when the Prophet finally conquered Mecca," Abba asked, his voice getting stronger, "what did he do? He forgave all the Meccans." "Yes." My father trailed off, and I could tell he was about to say something important. Sometimes his love for our faith would just pour out of him. I loved it when he got like this. I would just soak in his words. "Yes," he said, his eyes looking far away. "He forgave everyone. The very same people who had killed his family members, who had driven him from his home, who had waged war against him for years. When he finally had the power to punish them, he showed them all mercy. Is it any wonder he is called the mercy of Allah?" We all hung on his every word, feeling so much pride for our Prophet. The people saw his mercy that day, and they couldn't help but see the beauty of Islam. The message was so powerful that soon the whole land became Muslim, and the Muslim empire grew to become the greatest civilization the world had ever seen. While Europe was in its dark ages, Islam was in its golden age. He told us how much the world owed to Islam, in science, medicine, and math. But why would the Christians have treated the Muslims so badly later on? "Primera, aske." "My son," he said, they weren't following the true message of Jesus anymore. They had turned Jesus into a god, and that is why God sent the Prophet Muhammad with the final message for all of mankind. The older messages, like the Bible, had been changed over time. Only the Quran is perfect. Only Islam is pure. God will protect it until one day the whole world accepts its truth. That is, the day Islam will be victorious. We were all mesmerized by my father's passion. His vision for the future wasn't violent. It was a beautiful, romantic idea of destiny and peace. After a few moments of silence, Ami's voice brought us back to earth. "All right," she said, "that's enough. We're almost at the mosque. Let's get ready." And she was right. Time had flown by. I hadn't even noticed us getting off the ferry. I loved talking about these things. The Quran, God, the prophets. It all felt like part of a grand and beautiful story. A plan put into motion by the greatest man who ever lived. He had our hearts. He had our loyalty. Chapter 6. Righteous through ritual prayer. The Glasgow Mosque was one of my very favorite places when I was a child. It was a beautiful red stone building with a big green dome, tucked away at a funny little intersection near the river. Inside, it was a maze of floors and staircases and hallways, which made it the perfect place for a game of hide-and-seek with the other Muslim boys. Our community gathered at the mosque for everything, for holy days and celebrations, for funerals and weddings, for picnics and parties. The mosque is a very dear place for Muslims, especially for those living far from home, who miss being part of a community. But besides all the fun and the friendship, the mosque had a much more important purpose. Its main purpose was for prayer. The formal, ritual prayer that all Muslims offer 5 times every single day. We call it soothe. You begin by standing, then bowing low, then touching your forehead to the ground, reciting special words in Arabic that have been passed down for centuries. Each of the 5 daily prayers has its own name, and while the words and the movements are mostly the same, the number of times you repeat them is different for each prayer. It all adds up to 17 required repetitions every day. For many Muslims, the prayer times create the rhythm of the day. You wake for the first prayer at dawn. You take a break from work for the midday prayer. You head home after the afternoon prayer, have dinner after the sunset prayer, and prepare for sleep after the final prayer of the night. Before each prayer, there is a special ceremonial washing of the arms, face, and feet. And then, you hurry to join the others to pray together. And no matter where you are in the world, whether in Glasgow or Pakistan or America, all Muslims face the same direction when they pray. They face toward the holy shrine in Mecca, a simple, cube-shaped building called the Kaaba. The story is that it was built by Abraham and his son, Ishmael. And so, whether you are standing in a circle right beside it, or in a straight line halfway around the world, every heart is turned toward the same place. I've even seen prayer rugs with little compasses sewn into them, just to be sure. The prayer is led by one man, the Imam. Men and women pray in separate areas, but close enough so the women can hear his voice. As he leads, he recites long passages of the Quran from memory. In a way, this was a very clever method to share the words of the Quran. Long ago, when most people could not read, and it still works today. The most important quality for an imam is simply that he knows the Quran well. One of the beautiful things about this prayer is how it brings everyone together, side by side. Rich men next to poor men, leaders next to workers, all praying as one. It is a very solemn and quiet time. No one speaks. No one walks in front of those who are praying. No one interrupts. No one, of course, except a 5-year-old boy from America. Sometimes, while running around during the prayers, one of the men would give me a swift spank to get me to settle down. My parents were perfectly fine with this. They believed it took a whole community to raise a child, and they trusted the people at our mosque. I remember one time, I was feeling especially fidgety, and out of nowhere, I felt a sharp spank on my behind. I whipped around to see who it was, but there was no one there. I decided it must have been my uncle, who was standing next to me. After the prayer was over, I went to him with tears in my eyes and accused him of spanking me. Without even blinking, he just pointed up to the sky and said, "No." It was Allah. My eyes went wide. I thought, if only I had turned around faster, I would have seen the hand of God. 20 years later, my uncle told me the truth. It really was him. But for all those years, I was quite honored to have been spanked by God himself. And you can be sure that after that day, I always stood with perfect quietness during the prayers. Because these prayers are memorized. There is nothing made up on the spot. It isn't a personal conversation with God in your own words. For most, it is simply an act of duty. You might wonder, why do it? What's the point in reciting the same words 5 times a day, every day, especially if they are in a language that isn't your own? I wondered that myself when I was young, and when I asked my father, he said, "Nabil, before God, we are all unclean, and we need to be washed." Now, imagine if you took a bath 5 times a day. Think how clean you would be. The Salat, he said, is a spiritual bath that God has given us to keep our souls pure and clean. We couldn't always make it to the mosque for the 5 daily prayers, so we often prayed at home as a family. And if my father was away with the Navy, it was my job to lead my mother and my sister in prayer. I started when I was very young, as soon as my mother felt I was mature enough. But my favorite imam was always my father. His rhythm, his voice, his melody, it all just felt so right. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can hear his voice reciting the long passages of the Quran. I know those passages by heart because I heard him repeat them so many times. And that is how my father became my spiritual leader. And that is how the words of the Quran were carved into my heart, forever. That is the power of Salah. Chapter 7. Diversity in Islam. I remember a very special year, 1989. It was the 100th anniversary of our particular community within Islam, the Ahmadiyya community. To celebrate, a huge gathering was planned in England, and people were coming from all over the world. We felt so lucky that my father was stationed in the United Kingdom at just the right time. We would be there, among tens of thousands of people. Imagine a giant celebration out in the English countryside. There were massive tents set up as meeting halls, with paths of trodden grass connecting everything. There were tents for praying, tents for serving food, and even tents for selling little souvenirs. The gathering was separated into two areas, one for men and one for women. At 6 years old, I was still young enough to slip into the women's section without anyone minding, which I often did. It was so much more lively than the men's area. The women wore beautiful, colorful clothing. Their laughter was loud, and they talked and talked, mostly ignoring the serious speeches being shown on the televisions. The men's area was always so solemn, and for a 6-year-old boy, solemn just meant boring. During one of the main speeches, I decided to sneak away. I was on a mission. In the bazaar, they were selling special badges designed just for the celebration, and I really wanted one. But on my way, as I tried to slip past a group of people, a hand firmly grabbed my shoulder. That was never a good sign. An elderly man turned me around, placed his hand on my back, and steered me right into the main hall where the men were gathered. He sat me down near the front, a little too close to him for comfort. He did all of this without saying a single word, but the stern look he gave me said everything I needed to know. Sit down and listen to the speech. I had no idea who he was, but I knew better than to disobey an elder. The badge would have to wait, so I turned my attention to the speaker. He was a missionary from Pakistan, and his accent was so thick that it was very hard to understand him. But luckily, I had heard this kind of speech many times before. I knew what he was talking about. He was defending the fact that we were Muslims. The other Muslims, he said, his voice ringing with passion, they say, we are not Muslim. But who are they to cast us out? He reminded everyone of what the Prophet Muhammad himself had said. If you simply declare the Shahaditha, declaration of faith, in you are a Muslim. It isn't that simply. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. He was growing more and more passionate with every word. I found out years later that this man had seen his own loved ones suffer terribly, even killed, at the hands of other Muslims who did not accept our community. His words were not just a speech, they were fire from his heart. We say the Shahada, he declared, so we are Muslim. Do we reject any of our duties? He then listed the fundamental practices of our faith, what we call the 5 pillars of Islam. We declare our faith, he said, counting them off. We pray our 5 daily prayers. We give charity to the poor. We fast during Ramadan, and we make the pilgrimage to Mecca. We do all the things we are commanded to do. Who can deny that we are Muslim? He went on, listing the core beliefs, the 6 articles of faith. We believe in the one God, Allah. We believe in the angels. We believe in the prophets he sent to the world. We believe in the holy books he gave them. We believe in a day of judgment, and we believe that God's will is over everything. What is it that we don't believe? His voice grew louder. What we don't believe is falsehood. He was talking about the main division in Islam, the one between the Shia and the Sunni. Together, they make up most of the world's Muslims, but they disagree on who should have led the community after the Prophet Muhammad died. And then there are others, the remaining few percent who don't fit neatly into either group. That's where we stood. So why, the speaker pleaded, why do they call us non-believers? They called us this, he explained, because we disagree on the meaning of just 2 words in the Quran. 2 words, the seal of the prophets. He was talking about the most controversial part of our beliefs. The founder of our community, a man named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, had claimed that he was a prophet, but one who came under the authority of Muhammad. Most other Muslims believe the Quran teaches that Muhammad was the final prophet, and that there could be no others after him. Because of this disagreement, thousands of Ahmed Muslims have been persecuted and killed. They have taken the religion of peace, the missionary cried, and turned it into a religion of bloodshed. But God will restore Islam through our community. He has already sent us the promised one. And here was another difficult claim. Our founder had said that he was not just a prophet, but the promised figure that many religions were waiting for. The return of Jesus for the Christians, Elijah for the Jews, and others. As the missionary said this, a man in the crowd suddenly yelled out, "Talk!" And in one voice, thousands of men in the tent roared back, "Allahu Akbar! God is great!" Again, the man's voice boomed, "Takbir!" And again, the crowd erupted, Allahu Akbar! The air crackled with energy. Another man began to call out, Islam. And the crowd responded, Zindabad, long may it live. Islam, Zindabad. The roar of thousands of voices, all praising God together, was heart-stopping. Thinking about it now, as a grown man, I understand how complicated it all is. It's true, as the missionary said, that we lived our lives as devout Muslims. We followed the same rules and held the same core beliefs. But it's also true that our founder made some very bold claims that were deeply offensive to many people. It's not hard to see why some considered us a cult. And yet, I believe that Prophet Muhammad himself would have called us Muslim. He said, "Do not excommunicate anyone who declares that there is no God but Allah." What I really learned that day, sitting in that crowded tent, is that Islam is not just one single thing. It is a vast and diverse faith, filled with many different voices and many different stories. Chapter 8. The Path of Sharia. When you hear the word Sharia, you might not know that even within Islam, it can mean very different things to different people. It's not something the average Muslim knows a lot about. I first heard the word when I was a boy, at a special event our community held once a year. We called it an ayatama. Think of it as a kind of tournament, but with a mix of religious and physical competitions. The religious ones included things like memorizing parts of the Quran, reciting poetry, and giving speeches. I'm not really sure what the physical competitions were, because my mother always had me busy with the religious ones, especially the speech competition. Amy was a very serious coach. She didn't just write my entire speech for me. She trained me exactly how to deliver it. The nights before the competition, she would have me stand up and practice. Over and over, she would stand right behind me, moving my arms and hands for me to make the right gestures, as if I were her own little puppet. She showed me where to pause for dramatic effect, when to turn my head, and how to raise my voice to make the biggest impact. It all made sense when I found out later that she had been the captain of her debate team back in Pakistan. On the day of the tournament, I competed in the 6-2 arrow group. The topic of my speech was, always tell the truth, no matter what. And thanks to my mother's coaching, I won an award. After the kids' competitions were over, I decided to sit and watch the men. They were having a competition for speeches that were made up on the spot. The topics were things like, how do we raise our children in the Islamic way? Or how do we know Jesus is not the Son of God? Then a man I called Uncle Fassan, who spoke English very well, drew his topic. It was, explain Sharia, including its sources and its application. He stood up, greeted everyone formally, and began. The topic I've been given, he said, is Sharia. Sharia is Islamic law, and the word Sharia itself means the path. The correct path that we must walk to follow God's will. Elders who were judging the competition looked very impressed. There is no single book of Sharia, he continued. Instead, we have to find the law by looking at a few different sources in a very specific order. The first and most important source is the Quran. Nothing can ever be more important than the Quran, because it is the word of God. But, he said, the Quran doesn't cover everything. For that, we turn to the second source. The Hadith are the stories and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. He explained that these stories help to clarify what's in the Quran, but they never, ever contradict it. And if you still can't find an answer in the Hadith, you turn to the third source, the wise and learned scholars of Islam. So where do we see Sharia? He asked. We see it everywhere in the life of a devout Muslim. It guides how we pray, when we fast, who we can marry, what foods we should avoid. It covers all the basic things in our lives. He smiled, and the judges gave him a signal to wrap up his speech. That, he said, is a brief explanation of Sharia. And with a thank you, he sat back down. I would learn later that it was a very good answer, especially for a community. For us, the Ahmed Muslims, things were quite simple. Our leaders had the final say in understanding Sharia. What they said, we followed. But for most other Muslims, it's not so simple. They have more options. For example, a Sunni Muslim woman who wants a divorce must get approval from a religious scholar. But if she goes to one scholar and doesn't like his decision, she is free to go to another one and hope for a different opinion. Different schools of thought can lead to different answers. It gets even more complicated because different groups in Islam, like the Sunnis and the Shias, trust different collections of hadith, those stories about the Prophet. And since the hadith are the second most important source of law, this leads to real differences in how they practice their faith. But even with all these differences, there are many things that most Muslims agree on. For example, for a very long time, almost all the major schools of thought taught that if a person chose to leave the faith of Islam, they should be put to death. It was only smaller groups, like ours, that disagreed with this. I didn't learn all of these details on that day at the tournament. And really, most Muslims don't know all these things. They know their faith in the way they live it, day by day. More than anything else, that tournament, and gatherings like it, were about something simpler. They were about making us fall deeper in love with our faith, and bringing us closer together as a community. They reassured us that we had leaders who had the answers, even if we didn't. And by coming together like that, we became a very strong and happy community. Chapter 9. Dreams of the Faithful. I remember one night, driving home after a gathering in Glasgow. Something was wrong. My parents, Amy and Abba, were sitting in the front seat, and you could just feel the worry between them. We'd lost track of time, and the last ferry across the water to our town had already left for the night. This meant we had to take the long way home, a winding road that took almost 3 hours. But that had happened before, and my parents had never been worried like this. They were speaking in low voices, too quiet for my sister and me to hear in the back, but we could tell from their tone that something was deeply amiss. My sister Baji was the first to speak up. "Abba, what's wrong?" "Nothing, my dear," he answered. "Just check your seatbelt and try to go to sleep. We'll be home soon." My mother shot him a worried glance, but they said nothing more. A moment later, I tried. "What's going on, Amy?" "Did you hear your father? Do what he says." Whatever it was, they were not going to share it with us. And now, there was no way we could fall asleep. So we just pretended. After a few more minutes of tense silence, my mother seemed to make up her mind about something. She turned to my father. "Does it still look the same to you?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Actually, it looks even more like it." "Then let's turn around," she urged. "Let's go back." That seemed to be all my father needed to hear. He turned the car around and started driving back toward the city. Baji and I knew not to ask any more questions. The tension in the car was fading, but the worried mood was still there. "Should I find a hotel?" Abba asked. "No," Amy said. "We can stay at the Malik's home. They will understand." And just like that, my fear turned into pure joy. The Maliks were our closest friends from the mosque. I called them uncle and auntie, because they felt like a second set of parents to me. No matter what I was doing, whether I was being perfectly behaved or getting into all sorts of trouble, they always welcomed me with a warm hug. They had 5 children who were our good friends, and I was so excited at the thought of a surprise visit. Suddenly, the strange, scary car ride was forgotten. What made it even better was that this would be my very first sleepover. My mother was very protective and didn't like the idea of us staying the night anywhere without her. But this was different. We spent the night in a happy blur, playing board games and watching movies. And after our parents went to sleep, my friends decided to put on a new, scary movie. Predator. Now, when I say I had a sheltered childhood, I really mean it. A few minutes into the movie, I was absolutely terrified. I went to my bed and tried to fall asleep. But my dreams that night were a jumble of jungle hunts and strange, scary voices. I woke up feeling even more tired than before. The next morning, after a huge and delicious breakfast, Emmy was saying goodbye to Auntie Malik at the door. They waited until the men were out of earshot and began to speak in quiet voices. I was clinging to my mother's side, still feeling a bit shaken from the night, so she didn't mind me being there. "It's daytime now," Auntie said gently. "You can tell me what you saw." "Some dreams," my mother replied. "You don't share even in the daytime." And that was it. That was the answer to the mystery. My father had seen a dream. You see, In our family, dreams were taken very, very seriously. There is a saying from the Prophet Muhammad that the dreams of the faithful are prophetic. For many Muslims, dreams are the one way they might expect to hear a message directly from God. And for good reason. In my own family, people had dreams that came true all the time. Let me tell you about a time Abba was taking a test for a promotion in the Navy. The night before, he dreamed that he and 5 of his friends were on a battlefield. To be safe, they had to make it over a fence. In the dream, Abba made it over first, and only one of his friends made it over after him. The other 4 were left behind. A few weeks later, he found out that he and those same 5 friends had all taken the test, and just like in the dream, only he and that one other friend had passed. My grandmother, Nani Ami, once had a dream about her father, right after he had passed away. For 3 nights in a row, she dreamed he was knocking on her door, soaked from the rain and asking for help. The dream was so real that she decided to visit his grave. When she got there, she saw that an animal had dug a hole into the grave, and the recent monsoon rains had flooded it completely. Auntie could tell my mother needed to share the dream. "Tell me," she said softly. "I want to pray for you." My mother finally gave in. "Okay," she whispered. 2 nights ago, he had a dream. We were all in the car, driving down a dark road. The road was very narrow, and there was fire on both sides. But it was a dark fire, a fire that gave off no light. He couldn't see anything, and when he turned around to check on the children in the back seat, you were gone. Ami fell silent. "So what happened last night on the road?" Ante asked. My mother hesitated. "That long road home, it's a dangerous drive. Even in the daytime, we didn't think much of it until we were halfway there, and all the streetlights went out. It was so dark, felt too much like the dream. That's when we turned around. Whatever the dream meant, I think God saved us from it." Finally, Auntie turned to Ami with a warm smile. "Alhamdulillah," she said. "Thank God. Let us pray before you leave, and think no more of this." As we all gathered by the car, our 2 families prayed together for our safe journey home. Once we were back on the road, I asked my father if he'd had a bad dream. He glanced at my mother. "Yes, my son," he said quietly. "I had a bad dream last night, too," I told him. "It'll be okay." Abba chuckled softly. "There are different types of dreams, Bilu. What makes them different? When you have one that is from God," he said, "you will know." "Does God give you dreams a lot?" "Yes, my son. 2. Money." That was the last we ever spoke of it. A few days later, my father prayed to God and asked him to stop sending the prophetic dreams, and for the most part, they stopped. It has been over 20 years since that day. I, on the other hand, would one day reach a point in my life where I would spend hours praying, begging God for guidance through dreams. And as it turned out, my father was right. When I finally got one, I knew it was from him. Chapter 10. The month of blessing. My years in Scotland felt like a storybook. I had fallen in love with the land and its people. Our house was built on a hillside, and on cold mornings, you could often hear the distant, lonely sound of bagpipes echoing through the mountains. There were blackberry bushes in our yard, and just beyond a barbed wire fence, you could see sheep grazing peacefully. I started school there, and made some of my first real friends at our little mosque. The people were so kind. Moritan Onse, strangers would invite us over for dinner, while we were all just stopped at a red light. I loved Scotland so much that I even developed a thick Scottish accent of my own. But the Cold War was ending, and that meant the submarine base where my father worked was no longer needed. It was time for our family to move again, and as sad as I was to leave, there was one good thing I could think of. The holy month of Ramadan would be a lot easier. Ramadan is a special month for Muslims. For 30 days, from the moment the sun rises until it sets, we do not allow any food or water to pass our lips. It is a duty for every able. The Eid Muslim, a test of strength and faith. And at the end of the 30 days, we celebrate with a big festival, one of our 2 main holidays of the year. In Scotland, Ramadan was very, Very difficult, because it's so far north. The summer days are incredibly long. The sun would rise as early as 4:30 in the morning, and it wouldn't set until 10 o'clock at night. That meant fasting for about 18 hours every day. The hardest part wasn't the food. It was going without water for so long. But even with its strict rules, Islam can be very gentle. If someone is sick, or traveling, or unable to fast for any reason, they don't have to. There are always other ways to honor the holy month. And it's important to know that Ramadan is about so much more than just fasting. It's a time to build community, to heal broken friendships, to try to be a better person, and most of all, to grow closer to God. It's a time for visiting relatives, buying gifts, and preparing for parties. In many ways, it feels like a month-long Christmas, a time of celebration all across the Muslim world. The start of Ramadan was always an exciting and uncertain time. Every year, I would stand outside with my father, Abba, looking up at the sky, hoping the clouds would part so we could see the first sliver of the new moon. If we saw it, we would bow our heads and say a special prayer. My mother was never outside with us. She was always in the kitchen, already getting food ready for the next morning. We would wake up about an hour before sunrise. The first meal of the day was called seri, and it was meant to give us energy for the long day ahead, and to start our day together as a family. I can still hear my mother singing in the kitchen as she cooked for us, usually songs of praise to God or the Prophet. The table would be filled with food, yogurt, eggs, chickpeas, lentils, and so much more. And she would stand by the stove, making fresh, warm flatbreads, insisting that we eat them right away. My mother always loved serving food, but she was never happier than when she was serving her family during Ramadan. All through the meal, we would keep our eyes on the clock. We had a special calendar on the refrigerator that told us the exact moment of sunrise, the moment we had to stop eating. Just before that time, I would go to our prayer rugs and call out the adhan, the call to prayer. I remember one morning, my mother called out from the kitchen, half joking, "Bilu, call the adhan slowly today. I need more time to eat." And even though the call to prayer is supposed to be very serious, I started it as fast as I possibly could, just to hear her playful little yelp from the dining table. Maybe she'd cry out, laughing, "You should be ashamed of yourself." During the day, my sister and I would be at school. My mother was very careful about our fasting. If she thought for a second that it would interfere with our schoolwork, she wouldn't let us do it. "You're just practicing," she would say. "You don't have to fast for real until you're older." She spent her own days during Ramadan praying and reciting the Quran. It always seemed to fill her with a special kind of peace and joy. In the evenings, we would often go to other families' homes for iftar, the breaking of the fast. This was a time for the whole community to gather and celebrate. We would start by eating a single date, just as the Prophet Muhammad used to do. Then, we would pray together. And after that, we would share a big, wonderful meal. After a long fast, everything tasted so delicious. The funny thing about Ramadan is that, after feasting every morning and every evening for a month, most people actually gain a little weight. It wasn't until after we left Scotland that I was old enough to start fasting for the whole month. We left in 1990 and moved to a town in Connecticut. There was no mosque there, and it never really felt like home. I didn't make any good friends, and the saddest part of all was that I lost my Scottish accent. Scotland was where I had learned what it meant to be a Muslim, and where I had fallen in love with my faith. 3 years later, we moved again, this time back to Virginia. My father had been promoted, and the military promised this would be our last move. Virginia is where I would make friends that would last a lifetime. It's where I would grow up, and it's where I would first feel the painful clash between the culture of my family and the world I was living in. It was in Virginia where I would ultimately make a choice that would change everything. A choice to leave behind my faith and all that I had ever known.